you've kind of disappeared for a while. I think that's been an interesting fact of New York's art world life.
You think anybody noticed?
I think people noticed, but I think it's also, you know, what Namjoon Pike once used to say. I know he was a great friend of both of ours. He said, you know, the problem with is once you get known, if you disappear, people wonder what's happening, what's happened to you. It's better to be unknown all your life because then nobody worries.
I had very rough years because I lost a lot of people in my life. My father passed away, Holly passed away. I started a collaboration with a great Kashmiri poet who passed away. My two best friends in Israel, one died from cancer, another one was killed in one of those terrorist things. So it was kind of like 6 months, they were, you know, absolutely unthinkable, and it was not, you know, 6 people I knew. It was out of my 10 favorites, 6. So I was basically paralyzed. It was a very interesting moment when my father died. I got very close to him at the end, and he was really, really remarkable. Actually, this painting it's him. And all my life I was this kind of maverick, this kid that came to New York with nothing and made a big thing. My art was always about making something out of nothing. It was always about liberating the cheap things in life and breathing something into them. When my father passed away, and when we buried him, there was a reverse thing. I wasn't making anything. Actually, I was undoing something. I was putting something away forever. The most precious thing, the most precious object, my father, who I got so close to in the end, in ways that I cannot even begin to describe. And I was putting him away forever. So it was the reverse of making something. It was the unmaking of something. And yet, and it was the most emotional moment in my life. And I thought, I was standing there by the grave and I thought, I never want to make another object, ever. My father was the first child of a city in Israel called Netanya. I was the first boy. And I had this legacy of the family that I didn't really pay much attention to, but suddenly landed on me.
Well, you had left. You had broken one big rule by leaving in 1979. Was it
77.
77, and coming here.
Yeah.
And so you know, and to walk away from a support system that was there for you.
I didn't feel like I broke any rule, but in retrospect, I know that I broke many rules. And the consequences only years later started to be meaningful. So he was the first child of Netanya, and he was born in a tent there, and all the early pictures of his childhood is all the sand dunes, and no buildings, even riding the horse. And then there were 10 families, my family included, that built that city. Nothing glamorous, they were pretty poor.
What year was this one?
In 30s. He was born 1930, so they must have been there a couple of years before. And my great-grandfather built the cemetery. So when we went to the cemetery, it was like this tribal thing because all the stones had names of the family and friends, and it's kind of like an oasis. But when they opened the ground, suddenly it was back to the sand, which you don't see anymore. It's a big city, you don't see the sand. So all the history sort of jumped out of that hole. I don't know why, I took a camera with me and I took a picture of it.
So you got to this this empty space, which is actually a real blessing for an artist to be in an empty space, because then things start to build up again in a fresh way. But you don't know that at the time. You can even panic or become very depressed because it's. But then something amazing.
And then they kept dying. You know, Holly and they just kept going, and I was putting everyone away.
And 9/11 had just taken place.
9/11 was before.
Yeah, 9/11 had just taken place.
It was not nearly as traumatic as that for me. It was. I'm used to 9/11s. You know, maybe they're not as tall, but you know, I mean, there was bombs in my high school where I went there. Our building in Netanya was bombed twice. I mean, I'm used to that.
That's a very interesting thing to hear.
Actually, in fact, when it happened, it was a horrible, horrible thing, but I just thought America joined the world.
Yeah, no, of course. And we were pretty privileged.
This painting is a picture from a snapshot of my father sitting in front of the World Trade Center.
Right.
And last time he was in New York was a couple of days before.
I don't know if all of you had a chance to tour the studio and to see this remarkable new body of work. The project called Veiled Threats, which is still in process, which I think is going to make people stand up and take notice in a way that they may never have before. For all of the, top of the world that you were at in the 80s.
Because in this new work,
place.
Everything is coming together. Everything is coming together. And in fact, my work before was probably much more complicated to understand than this. But one more thing about...
Complicated in what way? I mean, in terms of the cultural references that you were engaging in, the collision between American culture and Israeli culture and Jewish culture and...
Yeah, like when the modern bought the black paintings in 1988 or something like that, I don't think that to this day they know what it's about.
When they bought those paintings, and we've had this conversation before, and I remember talking with Kurt Martineau about it when they brought those paintings, and they love them for one of the reasons that they can be loved, which is that they have this incredible formal beauty, and of course they are part of that whole tradition in post-war American art, whether it's Rauschenberg's black paintings or Stella's black paintings. They're black, and they have this formal elegance and kind of purity. But the difference between these and the Stella paintings, the Rauschenberg black paintings, is that they have very, very provocative and disturbing content.
Yes, they have narrative, and narrative has always been an important aspect of how I work. And
it's probably one of the reasons that you became an outsider in a way. I mean, It was a brief moment during the narrative boom of the 80s when there was a great interest in narrative story art coming out of conceptualism. But then narrative, again, got buried under the kind of pressure of formalist and more overt ideological formal
and then it got kind of, because you did the biennial of the identity,
You had to bring that up.
Yes. I'm very curious about how story works, how narrative is constructed, and how, because the most important thing one has to do with their lives is to possess their story. If you don't possess the story, you are basically lost. And in order to possess your story, and once you possess it, you can change your fate. You need to understand the story and how it works.
Tell me a little bit more what you mean about possess your story.
Actually, I stole that from Maya Angelou. She was talking about being raped. And when you're raped, not that I was, you don't own your story until you're able to say what happened, and then you own your story and you can move on. If you talk about Israelis and Palestinians, it is the Israelis that write the history of the Palestinians, the Israeli nouvelle historians. So every time a story like that is written by Israelis, the Palestinians own their history a little bit less. The first show that I did with Holly Solomon in 1983, it was my first, I had a show at the Kitchen before, but this was the first show in a big respected gallery. I really thought hard about how I was going to present myself in the world. I thought, well, what story can I tell that would connect with my culture somehow? So the only image I could come up with was the bride. That's kind of like a real Jewish thing, and it's really oppressive when you grow up in a Jewish family.
There's a Duchampian references also to the bride.
Yes, absolutely. And so my centerpiece was a black bride painted on white tulle. It was the first curtain painting. And I understood at that moment the whole issue of metaphors that are insufficient. How are you supposed to be Snow White on your wedding day when you're black? And from then on, everything was happening. But that was kind of the image that started it all.
What led you to use the curtain format, by the way? This kind of folded
the most
layers.
convoluted idea. It was not like I one day got up and thought this would be an interesting visual thing to do. I was at the Whitney Independent Study Program, and they were talking about collage and how collage evaded essence, and everything was so post-Marxist and post-structural and this and that, and exciting, you know, because it was intellectually. And I thought, no, wait a second, collage has an essence, it's glued. The seams are glued. So I was thinking, I'm going to come up with a form of collage where the seams are not glued. So that's how I did the curtain. And I mean, when I look back at it, it's the most convoluted way of getting to it. But it was kind of an interesting, came out of an intellectual exercise.
And it's interesting because it also happened at the beginning of what became, for better or worse, known as the pattern and decorating, the P&D.
Actually, it's the tail end of it.
Yeah, but it was seen within the framework of that in relationship to the domestic environment.
Because I showed at Holly's, the connection with the curtain couldn't evade the pattern decoration. Which is funny because pattern decoration, in fact, was never really decorative.
Well, they were rough, but they were beautiful. I mean, Kushner and Connell, those were not anything.
Well, the real message there was the post-Vietnam American kids who did not want this America the empire anymore. So it was no longer Warhol images of the great supermarket.
Yeah, the power and beauty.
Yeah, it was now the kids who were traveling, who were going to Morocco and India and Mexico.
We don't have time this evening to go through your entire career.
Thank God.
Because it's a little more complicated and deserves more time than we have tonight. But I'd love to be able to get people to an understanding of Veiled Threats and of this new body of work. Because I'm so moved by
Actually, there's something I wanted to say, because I started talking about my father and these ghosts that you will see later on, and you can ask me when you go around the house on these tulle curtains. But it dawned on me just a few weeks ago that the black paintings, which is based on Jean Genet's play The Blacks. Right. In the play that Genet wrote, the blacks they're divided into two groups, the upper class and lower class. Upper class wearing white masks, and they command the lower class to murder a white prostitute. So they can be condemned, and then all black is bad. It doesn't really work out. But you find out in the play that they actually never killed anybody. And when I painted the black paintings, I had one of the really amazing narrative dilemmas of how to paint something that didn't happen. And I solved the problem by having them kill the ghost of Manet's Olympia, who had a black maid. But it really dawned on me the other day how already back then, without really understanding, I was dealing with this disappearance thing, with this kind of ghostly thing.
This series of pictures painted. I'm going to use the word painted, even though
they're painted.
It's not painted by hand. It's painted by a device.
It's like Warhol silkscreen paintings are not done either.
Right, exactly. But these are paintings in the sense, in a very real sense. But they're paintings that are also very sculptural in the way they use space, the way they create depth, the way they create this sense of ghost, this sense of loss, this sense of impermanence, or kind of the idea that the image that we look at and we look back, it may not be there the next time we look. And it's something about this sense of impermanence and art's role in helping us deal with the transitory and the evanescent, that which can be lost. And it's a role that art has played throughout our history, but it's a role that art rarely plays today. And I think one of the reasons that these pictures will be seen as powerful as they are is because I think they bring back this it's not just that they're mournful, because in fact they're not. They're quite beautiful and uplifting, and they can even be funny or charming in rather conventional ways. But on a very profound level, I think they're about this sense of potential loss, that at any moment, it could be a moment of loss.
Yes.
Does that strike you?
The biggest lesson I learned from Shahid,
Can you explain who Shahid is?
Agha Shahid Ali is a Kashmiri Shiite poet that I was asked to collaborate with. And we ended up with a project called Veiled Threads. We decided that the veil will be the place where our two cultures, Jewish and Muslim, will meet. And then we decided to call it the Veiled Threads. And I'm doing a project which is room-sized paintings. We walk into a room, 4 walls. Each room corresponds to another of Shahid's poems. What I really learned from him is that what we consider nostalgia in the West is in the East it's a different thing. It's about loss. And the role of the poet, the Eastern poet, is actually to make you cry. And it's fine. That's what it's supposed to do.
But of course, sentimentality is
considered bad.
Is scorned
Yes.
in Western art, literature.
Yes. So it's walking a fine line, but I can't let go of it. And in fact, you know, it's not that I'm not sentimental particularly.
You're not?
No. Although, you know, it's funny, my father's last words to me, he said to me, I was an engineer and everybody saw me as one, but in fact that's not who I was. And I said to him, well, who were you then? And he said, I was a sentimental man. And so it's all around. I mean, it's all, any way I'm looking at this, it's coming back.
But sentimentality.
It's a good thing. It means you have something to remember.
Has been seen as the antithesis, the enemy of postmodernity. Postmodernity is about removing...
And modernity.
Removing the sentimental. And in a way, it's about not trusting kind of internal emotional response to the world and saying that clouds judgment. In a way, I see that the critical establishment, especially in the New York critical establishment, responds to art or to artists who step over the line of doubt and say, this work is about an emotional and spiritual response to the world. It connects with my emotional and spiritual engagement with my life in the world. And there's not a doubt about it. And that work remains suspect today.
Yes.
Critically suspect.
And
yes. Because having doubt.
And you can explain, you can understand it. You know, if you told me that I'd be sitting in the garden here for 2 years talking to the dead, if you told me this 10 years ago, I'd have you hospitalized. But in fact, it happened to me, and I had to understand what happened. And then I understood that ghosts are suspended emotions.
You see, that's one of the ways in which I think 9/11 has changed American consciousness and American art. Because of that engagement in the real that America had been immune to in so many ways.
I wonder if I've seen it in anything, though, but you'd know better because I don't get around.
Well, my sense is that one's going to see it in the response to this work when it's finished. Because I think people will understand that kind of letting go, kind of letting your, like breathing again.
It's funny that you say all this, and this painting happened to be the first serious one with the World Trade Center in it.
Yeah, that's.
But I didn't plan it.
Of course not.
You know, I didn't plan it.
So I do think that as much as I may enjoy this work, and others who share my sensibility may, I still think this work will probably come in for a critical thrashing. It's the kind of thing I've seen in response to other artists who step over the line and say, I'm not hedging my bet. I'm stepping into this space. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. People would rather stay with one leg on each side of the fence so they can go either way. I would say it's not ironic. And the lack of irony is going to be disturbing to a certain academic sector of the critical establishment. And that's just my, an opinion. I hope, in a way, I'm wrong. I hope that this change that has occurred that we're seeing in this work is occurring elsewhere, and hopefully the identity politics of the late 90s and early aughts.
When I first came to New York, I had a show at the Kitchen. There's some work back there. I grew up looking. There was no original art to look at. There was a Van Gogh like this size at the Israel Museum. I don't know. So I grew up looking at books, at reproductions, and the first work that I did here was kind of reconstructing reproductions by hand And that was my first show at the Kitchen when it was still in Soho. But it looked like it connected to the other work being done at the time that was dealing with opacity, with irony, with distance, appropriation, all that. But that's not where I was coming from. In fact, I was coming out of the book, not back into the book and production. And Douglas Crimp was interested in the work because of the way it looked.
Until he found out that it was about the authentic.
He came to see me. He came to see me, and I said, "Well, Douglas, I'm very happy that you are interested in work because I admire your work. But I'm coming. I'm coming from another place. It's like where I'm coming from. We can't afford loss of memory. We can't afford opacity. We can't. All these things that you're talking about. If I succumb to them, I would think I'm dead." And it was a very, very interesting conversation. And years later, that was in light of AIDS, and he said, "We have a Holocaust on our hands. We cannot afford to deal with opacity, distance, and irony." It was very interesting because I had this conversation with him 10 years before, but it was just what David is talking about. It looked good, it was interesting to look good, it was seductive, but it was all wrong.